I'm very excited this morning. I can tell you about our first speaker to start off our day is my friend Fae Johnstone, who has been one of the most compelling and courageous voices for queer and transgender inclusion this country has ever known. She is a trans woman, she's a small business owner, she is a feminist, a writer, and an award winner and an advocate. Her background includes helping youth mental health organizations through the Ontario Centre of Excellence for Child and Youth Mental Health, leading community fundraising and advocacy work at the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, and co-owning Wisdom to Action, championing 2S LGBTQIA+ feminist and progressive causes across Canada. And as the far right has targeted trans people and trans kids in particular with their campaigns of fear and disinformation, Fae has stood up and spoken up for justice. So delegates, please join me in welcoming my friend, Fae Johnstone.
Good morning. How are y'all doing today? There we go. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, and I want to extend my deepest gratitude for the solidarity that my community, queer and trans people, both here in BC and all across the country, have received from our labor movement. Thank you so much, and please give yourselves a round of applause. Our legacy as a country includes the criminalization of LGBTQ2+ people, the denial of our human and civil rights, inaction from our governments during the AIDS crisis, government-led efforts to remove us from the public service, police raids on our establishments, Canadian customs targeting our businesses and censoring our literature. We are a community that has been subjected to a horrifying legacy of discrimination, dehumanization, violence, and inequality that continues to this day. In my work today, I stand on the shoulders of giants, queer and trans people, gay men, lesbians, allies, and indeed our friends in the labor movement, who have created a Canada that is more inclusive, more free, and more equal for my community. I grew up in a Canada that filled me with hope. A Canada where I believed we were on the cusp of something truly incredible. A Canada where we had shed our age-old hostility to gender and sexual diversity, and where we were ready to embrace a more diverse, a more equal, and a more free vision of the future. Unfortunately, as we saw in recent provincial elections, homophobia and transphobia have made a resurgence. When I wake up today, I worry about the path that we are on as a nation. I worry that I will see the rights, the freedom, and the equality of my community stripped away in a political era defined by hate, by misinformation, and the politicization of queer people and our fundamental rights. And what do we say to that? Oh, there we go. My hope today is to speak a bit about the context that we are in and to invite you to continue this long-standing legacy of solidarity with queer and trans people. I also do want to recognize that I am a guest visiting these lands, but that I live on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, colonially known as Ottawa, and that my organization, the Society of Queer Momentum, is based in Chipuktuk-Mi'kmaq, colonially known as Halifax, Nova Scotia. One of the tactics of our opposition, of conservative governments and far-right ringleaders, is to try to pit communities against one another, to make you believe that the rights of trans and queer people are at odds with the role of parents, to make you imagine that we're pushing an agenda that is hostile to faith communities, or to imagine that the rights of racialized communities are at odds with the freedom of queer and trans people. And I think recognizing the land and understanding the legacy of this country is a powerful foundation to strengthen our solidarity. Prior to white folks and folks who look like me coming, well, maybe not as much like me, Prior to white folks and Europeans coming to these lands, Indigenous nations had not one but many ways of understanding, welcoming, and celebrating gender and sexual diversity. And it was only with the arrival of Europeans that we saw the imposition of a systemic, state-sponsored homophobia and transphobia. That is not to say it was all sunshine and roses before. I certainly was not around in those centuries. However, it is to recognize that this state structure that has brought hostility and brought discrimination towards queer and trans people is not intrinsic to these territories, but was a colonial import. And if we recognize that, if we recognize that these systems of homophobia and transphobia, but also of misogyny and of racism, are byproducts or creations that are not natural in our communities, we can see a shared struggle. And that is what most of my work is defined by, the concept of a shared struggle. That our opposition wants us fighting each other so that they can pass policies that restrict our rights, that centralize power in the hands of the few, while doing nothing to deliver for the everyday worker, the everyday parent, the everyday queer and trans person who just wants to live their life in a healthy community. I have spent the last decade advocating on queer and trans rights from coast to coast to coast. A year and a half ago, I founded the Society of Queer Momentum alongside my queer and trans friends and allies to respond to this critical moment in Canada, where we see for the first time in a long time, governments and politicians coming for queerness, coming for the rights of our neighbors, our friends, and our family members. As one of few public-facing trans advocates in Canada, I have paid a price for the work that I do. Last year, I had the opportunity to be included in a special edition campaign by Hershey's Canada. You will love this joke. It was my one moment of corporate fame and sellout, but it's fine. And I was excited to be on and part of this campaign, to hopefully give those young queer and trans folks another role model, another possibility model to see that they can indeed change the world. And when you're a young trans or queer kid, you don't see many people on screens or on chocolate bars who look like you do. Nothing could have prepared me for the backlash that my inclusion in this campaign led to. Overnight, I saw hundreds and then thousands of articles targeting me from the far-right ecosystem, not just here in Canada, but all around the world. Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, Jordan Peterson, these figureheads who take issue with trans people simply living our lives, decided to turn me into a symbol of everything that they hate. The degree of vitriol and hate mail sent my way was such that I was accompanied by security guards for 6 days straight. Unfortunately, that is just one of many examples. A few months later, in Regina, I was invited to speak at a feminist organization's fundraising gala, and Rebel News, a fake pseudo-media outlet, decided to publish a petition. Because, credible media is always in the game of publishing petitions targeting individual citizens. And they actually went so far as to release the location of my hotel, to publish my dead name, to share pre-transition and early transition photos of me in an attempt to make me feel shame. Luckily, both in the Hershey's fiasco and my involvement with the feminist organization in Regina, when I was targeted, some of the first and loudest people to come to my defense were leaders in Canada's labor movement. After decades of progress, 20+ years where we were doing the work, creating change, and having these hard conversations about different kinds of identities and families and ways of living, we are now indeed in a period of backlash. And some of it is, I think, motivated by a world that is afraid of the complexity and the diversity and the challenge that accepting 2S LGBTQI+ people presents. And sometimes in my own world, I think that we get caught up in our lingo a little bit. I think that sometimes workers and friends and family members worry that if you say the wrong pronoun, you screw up the acronym, or you trip over your tongue in an everyday conversation, you will be a bad person. I have a trans spouse, and I have misgendered my trans spouse, and we still got married. And so my invitation is, they want us to be scared of these hard conversations. Sometimes we will trip over our tongues and be imperfect, but fundamentally we are aligned because we are struggling not to memorize a certain set of letters or to know every different gender identity and sexual orientation out there, because we will always add to the list. What we are fighting for is indeed freedom. It is dignity. It is equality. I come from a community that is more likely to be homeless, more likely to be subjected to harassment in the workplace and beyond, more likely to experience discrimination in our hiring practices, a community that is all too likely to be forced out of our homes when we come out as young queer or trans people, and to meet services and supports that are not ready to see and support us as our full and authentic selves. And my invitation right now is for us to lean in. I don't need you, again, to be an expert on all things gay. I don't need you to memorize the science behind puberty blockers or to understand every intricacy of trans people's lives, because I swear to goodness, I've been trying for 10 years and I still don't understand how straight people live theirs. What I want you to be able to do is have those conversations with your fellow workers, to bring it back to those fundamental values of freedom, equality, and human rights, to help people understand what is going on. Because I don't think these politicians are focused on trans people because they hate us, though some of them undoubtedly do. I think that they're using us as a Trojan horse and a scapegoat. In Saskatchewan, we saw Premier Scott Moe preemptively invoke the notwithstanding clause to suspend the charter-protected rights of Saskatchewan children. Now, I don't think he just did that again because he has this issue with trans people. I think he did it to normalize governments removing one of the few checks and balances on their power. Do you know who else's rights are enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Those of our workers. Those of women, of racialized communities, of newcomers and faith-based people and communities. When we allow governments to target trans people and normalize the overvision of charter-protected rights, it weakens our shared human rights fabric. It makes it harder for us to defend and shore up those rights, and it makes it easier for governments to suspend those rights to interfere in our fundamental freedoms. Now, again, I don't need you to know all things queer and trans, but I do need you to understand the people who are being impacted by this new era of hate and hostility. I wake up every day and I think about the mom in Alberta who's wondering if she's going to have to leave her home province, the province she loves, and that maybe her family has lived in for generations, in order to get her kid access to the health care that her doctor recommends. I think about the kid in Saskatchewan who might not be fortunate enough to have an inclusive and safe environment at home, who has now had the freedom to be themselves stripped away from them in the classroom. I think about the trans person who just wants to live their life and is now seeing politicians aiding and abetting an agenda of hate that, aside from the direct impact of these policies, leads to greater hostility, greater harassment and stigma in the streets. Many of my trans siblings have been taught to make ourselves small. I, as a loud, broad-shouldered trans lady, very much struggle with that. But my siblings are taught that the best way to survive in this world is to go unnoticed, to shove yourself off, to stay in instead of going out to the local bar, because the everyday risk is such that you never know if today will be the day where somebody yells at you or screams at you. That isn't the Canada that I want to live in. And I don't think that's the Canada that any of us envision for our families and future generations. And so again, there is all this nuance, there's all this detail, and all this language and lingo, but it really is about the kids themselves, who we promised 20 plus years ago, we promised them that they would grow up in schools that were safe, and schools where they could be themselves. And we promised my whole community that we were welcome just as much as our straight and cisgender peers to contribute to society and to live a good life. That is what is at stake today. Across the country in the past 3 years, we've seen a staggering rise of anti-2S LGBTQIA+ hate. Oh, I laugh at my own acronym. I do just call us the gays informally, but that doesn't mean that you're allowed to. I have some brownie points. But queer and trans communities might be our path forward, though I do enjoy watching liberal politicians stumble over our acronym. Every year for 3 years, Statistics Canada has reported increases in anti-queer and anti-trans harassment and hate. We have seen protests at community spaces and schools, the burning of pride flags, and threats against LGBTQ+ activists and cultural figures. For the first time, as someone who's done this work for 10 years, I have parents who are afraid to speak out because they are scared that their kid will be doxxed if they put their name on an op-ed or speak out in their local radio. What do we say to that? We are seeing this resurgent far-right and social conservative movement that is working with conservative politicians to roll back the rights of my community. We have seen in New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Alberta policies that fundamentally restrict the rights, freedom, and healthcare access of transgender people. We have seen the Conservative Party of Canada vote to ban evidence-based gender-affirming healthcare for our kids, interfering, ironically, in the family decision-making and the role of parents in supporting their kids to access the healthcare that is best suited to their needs. We have seen this agenda to deny trans women access to women's spaces and services. Now, imagine if you are a 21-year-old trans woman who is kicked out by your spouse the day that you step out of that closet. Maybe you're working class and you don't have a lot of money. Maybe you aren't safe at your workplace and are let go under some other excuse, but you know it's really about your transness. And then you go to your local women's shelter, a shelter that wants to serve you because Canada's feminist movement are big champions and allies of trans rights. But you go to that space and they have to deny you service because a federal conservative government has made it illegal for a trans woman to enter those premises. What do we say to that? Pierre Poilievre has come to the defense of conservative premiers overriding charter-protected rights, limiting freedom and eroding the integrity of Canada's healthcare system. And he's doing it because, again, he wants us to be dominated by anger, by division, by fear, and to stop seeing the fundamental humanity and dignity of our neighbors. The clicker stopped working. There we go. Okay. To give you a bit of a glimpse into what these policies look like, because I think they're talked about and there's a lot of misinformation about them. The first piece is inclusive policies in our classrooms. What these policies that we're seeing from conservative premiers do is they force trans kids to stay in the closet and pit parents against kids. If you are a young trans person and you're not ready or not sure about coming out at home, you deserve the freedom to explore who you are at school. We know that that freedom makes it easier for you to have that hard conversation with your parents because you have teachers, your peers backing you up. We also know that kids deserve the space to explore who they are without being required to get a parental sign-off to be themselves in the classroom. If we were to do this for gay kids, we would be affronted. We would be disgusted. The idea that you would have to get parental permission to come out as gay or hold your 16-year-old boyfriend's hand in the classroom would be repugnant to us. What they have done is they have just swapped out the word gay for trans and hoped that the public wouldn't notice. We are seeing, again, interference in evidence-based healthcare. This is a Trojan horse effort to restrict our bodily autonomy. The folks who are pushing the bans on trans youth and their healthcare It's not your everyday homophobe or transphobe. It's not your great uncle who says a slur sometimes if he stubs his toe. I am very down to have a conversation with that guy. This is the Campaign Life Coalition. It is the biggest anti-choice lobby that pushed the Conservative Party of Canada to pass a motion that, if brought into legislation, would ban trans people's access to health care. Because if you set the precedent of a government interfering in your bodily autonomy when it comes to trans kids, it makes it easier to do so when it comes to reproductive rights and access to abortion. They are not doing this simply because of trans people. They are doing this because they can break new ground and set new precedents in the fight against women's rights, in the fight for reproductive rights. They are banning trans people from sports and recreation. Trans people have historically been forced out of these spaces already. And while, yes, some trans folks like myself are a little bit taller, I have met many a cisgender woman who is a lot taller than I am. They are called butch lesbians, and we love them. I'm all about having a conversation about fairness in sport. So let's start by talking about how a rich kid in the suburbs has an unfair advantage over a poor kid in a neighborhood where they have no pool, no hockey arena, and no baseball nets. They are again using us as a scapegoat to fuel hate and animosity, and to make you focused on those people over there while they continue to not invest in women's sports, while they continue to not invest in supports for women fleeing violence, while they continue to fail to deliver on the priorities of everyday people. If we think that this is about trans people, or woke BS, I'm sorry for the unparliamentary language, we have already fallen for their trap. We are going to lose if we imagine that this is just about those sad trans folks over there, instead of an existential threat to our progressive movements from coast to coast to coast. Yeah. I believe in my slides. Fundamentally, so much of this is about responding to a new era of far-right weaponization and attacks on gender and sexual diversity. What they're doing here is they are taking advantage of the public's lack of familiarity with trans people. They're spreading misinformation to mislead the public and push narratives that turn us against our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, while equally reducing trust in our institutions. This is not about trans people, but it is a moment where we need solidarity, once again, from our friends in the labor movement. Our culture is at stake. Our vision for the future is at stake, and the kind of country we want to be for future generations. If they succeed with this hateful rhetoric, what we will see is Canada's culture as a place that respects diversity, that embraces equality, and recognizes different kinds of families, different kinds of communities. We will see that fundamentally eroded. We will see the ability for our progressive movements to win made more difficult by that culture of hate and animosity towards different kinds of communities. Next slide, please. There we go. And next slide after. There we go. My community is under attack. We're seeing it everywhere. And we're not used to this. It's been 20 years since we've had to fight a fight like this one. Since marriage equality, we have been on the up and up. And many of our organizations have gone through the trajectory of many other movements. We've shifted from fighting in the streets and organizing to delivering government-funded services to meet the immediate and material needs of our communities. This is the evolution we saw in the feminist movement. It's the evolution we've now seen in the queer and trans community too. And that's an incredible, laudable evolution. It means when the gay kid's kicked out of their home, they're more likely to have supports. It means that the dad who is struggling with their trans kid is more likely to have somebody to call and another dad to have a conversation with. But what it means is that we are not ready for the moment that we are in today. It means that we are less organized. It means that we don't have the resources to fight back. In New Brunswick, when this all began, I am convinced that if we had been ready with the right ad, with the right radio message, that wasn't, a broad-shouldered, deep-voiced trans lady on a stage, but was a dad saying, My kid came out as trans last year, and I promise you, honestly, I still don't get it. But my kid is happier and healthier now than ever before. And so my world has been reacting because we're coming from a place of fear. And many of our fellows and peers in progressive movements have been struggling to adapt as well. For a long time, you could simply say trans rights are human rights, and it would win. It would work. We would also feel good about ourselves because we were showing our support for those trans folks and gay folks, and it would be a message that we felt good delivering. But then the strategies of the far right shifted. They stopped being as explicit with their homophobia and transphobia, and they started using coded language that was meant to mislead the public. To respond to this moment, we need to organize and we need to fight back, but we need to fight smart and organize to win. Thankfully, that's what my organization is all about. Next slide, please. Queer Momentum, we were founded just 18 months ago to advance a more free, equal, and socially just future for queer and trans people and for everyone. The way that we do that is by mobilizing campaigns to hold governments and politicians accountable, supporting activists on the ground to build skills, understand the strategies of our opposition, and fight back with a message grounded in freedom, equality, and human rights. We have also spent the last 18 months building coalitions across and within movements that have the same values that we do. And for us, we have been grateful so deeply because our biggest supporters have been Canada's labor movement. Next slide, please. Since 2023, we were the national organization that showed up in New Brunswick, Alberta, and Saskatchewan to support activists on the ground. We were there alongside Egal Canada, the leading organization for 2S LGBTI+ human rights. And as they sued governments, we built coalitions and empowered activists on the ground to fight back. But through this journey, we've learned some tough lessons. Next slide, please. We've learned that reactivity, falling for the bait, and stepping into their traps is not a winning formula. This is not about parental rights or so-called parental rights. This is about defending the freedom for trans kids to be themselves. Because whether you wear a headscarf, use a wheelchair, or have a different name than people expect, you deserve to be treated with dignity in the classroom. We do not win by catastrophizing. Unfortunately, while in lefty circles, we might candidly call some premiers homophobes and transphobes and sometimes fascists, that language and message does not win over the public. It makes us look like the radicals over there as they stand up for families, even as, again, they oppose childcare, they oppose supports for young people, and they imagine an economy that is built for big bosses over everyday humans. We have to be organized, and we have to reject perfectionism. I am not in this fight to feel good. I'm not in this fight to get pats on my back as the trans person on stage. I am in this fight to win for queer and trans people, but to win for workers, for women, for racialized communities, and in fact, for all Canadians. Next slide, please. The lessons that we've learned in terms of what works begins with reclaiming freedom. We've done the testing on this in Alberta, and the message that changes hearts and minds is a message of freedom. Freedom from boxes, freedom to be yourself, whether, again, you're Muslim or Hindu, whether you're Christian or Catholic, regardless of your identity, you deserve the freedom to be yourself, to be treated with dignity and safe in a healthy community. We meet people where they are at. You know, I spend a lot of my time speaking with workers, including workers who don't live in my little gay bubble. And my favorite thing is that they don't want to be lectured at. They don't want to be condescended to. They don't feel like seen when we go in and say, cis heteronormativity in 2S LGBTQI+ communities. But when you meet them where they're at and talk about freedom, and talk about what kind of community they want to live in, talk about what kind of future we want for our families, we can bring everyone along with us. And we've seen that evolution. My dream, quite simply, is when there's the next drag story hour that is protested, I want every stereotype of a worker to show up in that space. I want the big guy. Because actually, half of the game right now is that when I go on stage and I'm on TV, it's harder for me to reach a lot of audiences. Again, I am 5'11", broad-shouldered, deep-voiced trans lady with gorgeous hair. And while I am a great messenger in many a context, it's the dads, even the dads who don't have a trans kid, it's the dads and the moms and our friends who can reach audiences that are not ready to hear from somebody like me. We win by building coalitions, by bringing a message that is full of love, that is full of unity, and focused on freedom. We win with hope and defiance in response to hate and anger. Next slide, please. The awkward part is I want to skip slides now. Oh, we'll get there. The fundamental thing here is to understand what we're fighting for. Yes, we're fighting for queer and trans rights because we recognize that Canada is a better place when all marginalized communities are lifted up. But at its core, we're fighting for a world where everyone can live a good life in a healthy community, where everyone has strong public services, a social safety net, and a culture that respects diversity and strives for equality. That is the core of our shared vision of a better future for everybody on this land, and it is a future worth fighting for. I'm going to invite us to skip 3 slides. One more slide. One more slide. Hell yeah, we got there. My invitation is to prepare for what's coming next. We are going into an election where the narrative is favoring the Conservatives, where anger and affordability crisis and misinformation are making it harder for progressives to break through and win. The stakes in this election are going to be higher. We've got a leader of the Conservative Party who terrifies me. He is a powerful communicator, and he was more than willing to sacrifice his values to use dog whistles that pit us against each other. He will literally say that he wants to not speak to the lobbyists on the Hill, and then he'll sell hundreds of dollars worth of tickets to get their money into his war chest. But he's also echoed this anti-trans and anti-queer rhetoric. The rights of queer and trans people, of workers, of women, are going to be on the ballot in, hopefully, October of 2025. And to win, we have to work together to build power, change hearts and minds, and fight for the big issues that matter to all of us. Those are affordability, housing, healthcare, and human rights. That doesn't mean we shy away from going toe-to-toe when they come for trans and queer people, but it means that we stay focused, too, on the big picture, on the big issues that matter for most people in this country. When we are divided, they win. When we are united, we can change the world. Next slide. As I begin to close, my invitation now is, and my hope now is to share some opportunities for you folks in the room to continue this legacy of solidarity with queer and trans people. Next slide. These are the 3 spaces where I invite support. The first is amplification and advocacy. My organization is building a movement, and we've got queer and trans activists from coast to coast to coast ready to tap in. I'd like to joke that I know more gay people than anybody else in Canada, and I don't think it's really a joke. But we need our workers and allies out on that local picket line, out in front of that drag story hour, out protesting and speaking up with us. I dream of seeing, as I am seeing more and more today, union signs and flags at every gay protest, because that shows the power of unity. We also need you to bring us into your world, because I don't expect every worker or every union leader to be an expert on all things gay. But we can come in and reach your workers and have these conversations to get back to the basics of freedom, equality, and human rights. But the last piece I need is support building movement infrastructure and power. My world has not, as I said before, had to fight these fights in 20 years. We are rusty. But as we had the narrative on our side, workers had to keep organizing in every workplace to get and win better for workers. And we need your expertise. We need your infrastructure, and we need your support. Whether it's financial or in-kind resources, unions can help us leverage the untapped power of queer and trans movements. I firmly believe that my world has a lot to offer the broader progressive movement. We have queer and trans people who are passionate, who are organized, who are embedded in communities across the country. Now imagine if we were united if we were strategic, if we connected all of those dots and we're speaking up together, not just on queer and trans issues, but showing up on those picket lines. I am ordering signs that say queers heart workers, and I'm going to have so much fun sending my people out to support striking workers in every corner of this country. Next slide. And so my first invitation is for you to give me your mailing address and your email. If you scan the QR code on your screen, you will be brought to Queer Momentum's newsletter sign-up page, and that will be our way of starting to tap you into what we're up to. We are going to be plugging our little gay world into the labor movement's actions for the next federal election, and we invite you as local leaders to do the same, because again, we are stronger when we are united. Next slide, please. My second ask, and I'll make sure that everyone who didn't have a chance to scan the QR code finds a way of getting to it. My second ask is to amplify a call to action from a local organization, the Society for Advocacy for Gender-Affirming Healthcare. In Canada, I need a win. My community is scared, we are worried, and we have seen a lot of governments come for our rights and freedoms. What I want from BC is to show that we can unite people and deliver on the material issues facing a historically marginalized community, and to bring a bit of hope and optimism back to queer and trans advocacy in an era where so many of us are fearful for our future. And so if you do one thing while you gaze at this stage, it is to go to that QR code and show your support. More than that, it is to take that URL and drop it into your Slack channel, into your Signal chat, into your next local communication or newsletter. If you can do that, if we can see Canada or BC's labor movement speak up to advocate for our trans siblings, we can make that win happen. And we can show our trans siblings in this province that they are backed up by their friends in the labor movement. Next slide, please. My commitment to you is that if you and as you show up for us, we will show up for you too. I have been living in Canada's labor movement for the last year and a half, and it has been an incredible privilege and honor. I was just on the East Coast at the Federation in Newfoundland and PEI, and I saw workers who are fighting for freedom and for better for themselves and their families. My hope and my dream is for us to be more united. And that, again, isn't about having those hard conversations, but showing up for each other, too. As one of the few explicitly political queer organizations with a staunchly progressive mandate, we can show up for you because it is what we believe in, and it is the future that we are fighting for. And so when you come to that drag story hour, know that we will show up at your picket line, too. Next slide. In the face of hate, we stand tall and we keep fighting for freedom, equality, and human rights. When we organize, we win. And we have won time and time again. This is a period of backlash, not just for queer and trans people, but a backlash against progressive causes and movements. But we have been here before. I stand, as I began with, on the shoulders of giants, of gay men, lesbians, queer and trans people, and allies, who fought for my rights at a time when police were more than happy to brutalize members of our communities. And they won then. A decade later, we fought to get government action on the AIDS crisis that stole from us a whole generation of queer and trans people. We fought and we won. In 2005, 2006, we fought and we won marriage equality. In 2016, we fought and we won trans rights. This is a scary period, but in periods of backlash, we build power. In periods of backlash, we come together, we unite on what is right, and we fight for what we believe in. And so we are not scared in this era of polarization and this era of hate. We are defiant, we are united, because when we fight, we win. When we fight, we win. When we fight, we win. Next slide. Thank you. And on time.